Story 1. Alexander at the Hydaspes, the storm over India. The year was 326 BCE. The monsoon clouds hung low over the Punjab plains, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Rivers swelled with furious currents, and the land itself seemed alive with thunder. It was here, on the banks of the great Hydaspes River, what we now call the Jhelum, that Alexander of Macedon prepared for one of the most decisive battles of his life. Alexander had crossed deserts, mountains, and empires. From Greece to Persia, no army had ever stopped him. Yet when he looked across the raging river, he saw a sight unlike any he had faced before. An army bristling with war elephants, towering beasts clad in armor, their tusks sharpened, their eyes glowing like fire in the storm. And at their head stood King Porus, a man of immense stature, mounted upon an elephant, unshaken and proud. Alexander's men whispered in fear. They had fought cavalry, archers, and phalanxes, but elephants? These were monsters of war, living fortresses that could crush men and horses alike. For the first time, some of his veterans wondered if they had finally met their match. But Alexander, the boy who had tamed Bucephalus, the man who believed himself son of Zeus, did not waver. He studied the river, the currents, the cliffs, and the storm. He knew victory would not come through strength alone, but through cunning. For days, Alexander feigned attempts to cross, sending troops up and down the riverbank, tricking Porus into shadowing his every move. The Indian king watched, waiting, his elephants restless in the mud. Then one night, under the cover of darkness, Alexander led a chosen force across a hidden ford. The river was merciless, sweeping men and horses into the current, but Alexander shouted above the roar, "Hold fast! The gods are with us!" When dawn broke, Porus saw too late the Macedonians had crossed. The earth trembled as elephants advanced to meet them. What followed was a clash that shook history. The ground turned to chaos. Arrows rained from both sides. The elephants charged, tusks skewering soldiers, trunks hurling men like ragdolls. Horses panicked, rearing at the monstrous beasts. But Alexander rallied his cavalry, wheeling them around the elephants, striking from the flanks while his phalanx pressed forward with long sarissas, stabbing at the beasts' vulnerable legs and eyes. The air filled with screams, of men crushed beneath elephant feet, of beasts pierced by spears trumpeting in rage as they turned against friend and foe alike. At the center of it all was Porus himself. Towering above the battlefield, spear in hand, he fought like a titan, refusing to yield. His elephant struck down Macedonians by the dozen, and even Alexander from horseback marveled at his courage. Hours bled into each other. The riverbank was slick with blood, the rain mixing with it into a crimson mire. Finally exhausted, wounded, and surrounded, Porus was brought before Alexander. The conqueror looked into the eyes of the defeated king and asked, "How do you wish to be treated?" Porus, standing tall despite his wounds, replied with a single line that would echo through history, "Like a king." Alexander smiled, "You shall have it." And instead of crushing him, Alexander restored Porus to his throne, even granting him more territory. For the first time, the great conqueror recognized not just an enemy, but an equal. The Battle of Hydaspes was not just a war for land. It was a war of respect, a clash of worlds, where Alexander learned that even the greatest conquerors must bow to the greatness of others. Story 2. Alexander at Gaugamela. The fall of an empire. The plain of Gaugamela stretched vast and barren beneath the October sun. Dust shimmered in the air, and every soldier on both sides knew the world would change before nightfall. To the east stood the army of Darius III, the great king of Persia. His force was colossal, nearly 200,000 infantry, tens of thousands of horsemen, and monstrous scythed chariots bristling with blades. War elephants loomed among the ranks, their trunks curling, tusks tipped with iron. It was the might of an empire assembled to crush a single man. That man was Alexander of Macedon, only 25 years old, yet undefeated. He had crossed the Hellespont years earlier with a small army, and now stood poised to bring Persia to its knees. But his army was tiny in comparison. 40,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry. Outnumbered more than 5 to 1, they had no room for error. The night before, Alexander's generals begged him to attack under darkness. He refused. "I will not steal victory. I will take it in the light so all the world sees." At dawn, he led his men to the field. His phalanx stretched across the center, dense, disciplined, bristling with the long sarissas. On the left, the veteran general Parmenion guarded the flank. Alexander himself took the right wing, mounted on his black stallion Bucephalus at the head of the companion cavalry, the weapon he wielded like lightning. The Persians advanced first. The ground thundered as the scythed chariots charged, wheels spinning, blades flashing. The sight alone could freeze a man's blood. But Alexander had trained for this. His infantry opened channels, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through, then cut down the drivers with javelins and spears. The unstoppable machines of war were reduced to wreckage in minutes. Then came the cavalry. Persian horsemen swept around the flanks, trying to encircle the smaller army. On the Macedonian left, Parmenions' men bent under the weight, the clash of steel and screams rising in the dust. At that moment, Alexander saw what he had been waiting for. The Persians, in their eagerness to envelop his army, had stretched too far. A gap yawned open in the center, not far from where Darius himself stood in his golden chariot. Alexander raised his arm and shouted, "Companions, follow me!" With a roar, the companion cavalry formed a wedge and charged. They smashed through the gap like a thunderbolt, spears lowering, hooves pounding. Persians fell in heaps, the wedge driving deeper and deeper until Alexander himself was within striking distance of the great king. Darius looked on in horror. Before him was the Macedonian conqueror, his spear leveled, his horse unstoppable, his eyes burning with fury. For a moment, the two locked gazes, two rulers, two empires colliding in silence. And then fear broke him. Darius turned his chariot and fled. The Persian line collapsed. Soldiers who had once seemed invincible now ran in terror, throwing down weapons, trampling one another in their panic. Word of the king's flight spread like wildfire, and with it Persia crumbled. On the left, Parmenion fought desperately to hold his ground. Persian cavalry pressed so hard that he sent frantic messengers to Alexander begging for help. But by the time Alexander wheeled his men back, the battle was already lost for the Persians. The sight of their fleeing king had drained their will to fight. The plain became a graveyard. Macedonian soldiers pursued the broken enemy for miles, cutting them down without mercy. Dust turned red with blood. The cries of the dying carried into the night. By sunset, the once mighty Persian army no longer existed. Darius had fled east, his empire shattered. Alexander returned to camp in silence, his armor dented, his horse bloodied. His men hailed him as Lord of Asia, victor over the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Yet Alexander did not celebrate. He looked eastward, toward lands unknown, India with its rivers and elephants, and felt the hunger still burning inside him. The Battle of Gaugamela was not just a victory. It was the fall of Persia, the rise of a legend, and the moment history itself bent to the will of a single man. Story 3: The River of Fire. Alexander at the Granicus. The river Granicus flowed cold and fast through the plains of Asia Minor, its banks steep and treacherous. The Persians believed it was an impenetrable barrier. Along the far shore, their cavalry lined the heights, glittering armor, tall banners, and horsemen drawn from across the empire. They had chosen their ground well. It was May of 334 BCE, and Alexander was only 22 years old. Yet here he stood, leading 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry across the threshold into Asia. Behind him lay Macedonia, safe but small. Before him stretched the Persian Empire, the greatest realm the world had ever known. If he failed today, the dream of conquest would drown in the Granicus before it had even begun. The Persian satraps were confident. They jeered across the river, calling him reckless for even considering an attack. The river was swift, the banks steep, and the cavalry above would cut his men down as they tried to climb. The wise move would be to wait, to seek another crossing, to avoid battle. But Alexander was not a man who waited. He gathered his generals and declared, "I will not give the Persians a day's peace. If we hesitate, their courage will grow. We cross here, we cross now." The sun dipped toward the horizon, turning the water red as blood. Alexander mounted Bucephalus, the black stallion who had carried him since boyhood. He rode to the front of his companion cavalry, his bronze helmet shining, the crest of white plumes streaming in the wind. He lifted his spear high and shouted, "Follow me!" With a roar, the Macedonians surged into the river. Horses plunged into the current, men splashing. Shields lifted against the Persian arrows that hissed down from above. Water foamed around them, but they pressed on, climbing the slippery banks under a storm of missiles. The Persians charged. Their cavalry swept down, lances lowered, striking at men still struggling to climb from the water. The clash was brutal. Spears shattered, horses collided, and men were dragged beneath the surface to drown. Alexander led the charge himself. He drove straight into the heart of the Persian line, his wedge of companions cutting a path through the enemy horsemen. He fought like a man possessed, his spear finding gaps in armor, his shield ringing with blows. Then came the moment that nearly ended it all. A Persian noble, Reshaped, rode hard at Alexander and struck him on the helmet with such force that the crest was sheared away, leaving the young king dazed and exposed. Another, Mithridates, raised his axe to cleave Alexander's skull. Time seemed to freeze. But before the blow could fall, Clitus the Black, one of Alexander's fiercest companions, thrust his spear through Mithridates' side. The axe fell harmlessly, and Alexander, regaining his senses, drove his own spear through Reshaped's chest. The danger had passed, but the brush with death left the king's men more determined than ever. The battle raged on the riverbank. The Macedonian phalanx began to cross in support, their long sarissas bristling like a forest of steel. Slowly, relentlessly, they pushed up the slope. The Persians, expecting to crush the invaders in the water, now found themselves locked in hand-to-hand combat with a disciplined wall of spears. The tide turned. The Persian cavalry faltered, their lines breaking under the weight of the Macedonian advance. When Alexander ordered his reserves forward, the Persians broke. Panic spread, and soon the satraps themselves fled the field, abandoning their men. As the sun set, the plain belonged to Macedonia. The river that had seemed an unbreakable defense now ran red with the blood of Persia's best horsemen. That night, Alexander walked among the wounded. He spoke to his men by name, praising their courage. He ordered the burial of the dead with honor, both friend and foe, for he believed even enemies deserved respect in death. When his officers urged caution, reminding him how close he had come to death, he simply smiled. A lion does not test the strength of the deer. Persia is vast, and this was only the beginning. And so it was. The victory at Granicus opened the gates of Asia. One by one, cities fell before him, and the Persian satraps melted away. It was at the Granicus that the world first learned the truth. Alexander was no mere king. He was a force of destiny. The Persians had thought the river would stop him. Instead, it became the first step on a road that would lead him to Issus, to Gaugamela, and to the ends of the known world. On that evening in May, as his army camped on the far bank, the young conqueror gazed eastward. His hair, wet with river water, clung to his brow, his armor dented and bloodstained. He whispered to himself words none could hear. "Asia is mine.